Should you buy a townhouse in New York City? We'll demystify this topic in the following video. I'm Nick at Houseit. Visit houseit.com to learn how to save money if you are looking to buy, sell, or rent here in New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, or South Florida. So let's get started. So we're going to go through several reasons why you should buy a townhouse here in New York City. The first reason to consider buying a townhouse over an equivalently priced apartment is the matter of you yielding a greater amount of square footage and overall lot size relative to your financial investment. To cut out all the jargon, basically what we mean is you usually are going to get more for your money. The quote-unquote price per square foot may be much lower. You're just going to get more lot size, more acreage, more space, more land that is your own. And theoretically, over the long term, the greater exposure you have to an asset class, i.e. the more square footage you have, the more size is associated with your lot, potentially would give you more upside. So that's one reason to consider buying a townhouse or some sort of single or multifamily property or structure in New York City compared to a typical condo or co-op apartment. Another reason why you should consider buying a townhouse in New York City is because of the fact that you can actually obtain a multifamily property which can help minimize your costs associated with carrying the property over time. In other words, if you have like a 2-unit or 3-unit townhouse, you live in one of the apartments, the rental income that you will generate will make it less expensive for you to own what would otherwise be a rather expensive and substantial monthly payment over the course of ownership. And of course, as a result, you're going to have a lower stress lifestyle. People are basically helping fund your mortgage payment, and you have a bit more of an investment angle associated with your property. Whereas if you just bought a apartment, your own apartment, you cannot subdivide it. You don't have other tenants, so you're on the hook for that full amount of your mortgage payment every month. Another reason why you should buy a townhouse in New York City is the ability to customize. Now you might be asking, well, can't you just customize a condo or co-op? Of course, you definitely can do that as well. But the reality is it's a lot easier to renovate and customize a townhouse. And that's because you don't have a bunch of people who have been, forcibly inserted into the process who you have to deal with. For example, the management of a building, the condo board, neighbors who might complain. There's just so many people that you have to appease. And generally speaking, appeasement in New York City when it comes to condos and co-ops means money out of your pocket, which is not something you'd have to worry about when you're renovating a townhouse. Of course, you still have the Department of Buildings, and you do have to play by a certain amount of rules, but you just have that major red tape removed. Again, the condo building, the board, the peculiarities of potential neighbor, people on the board, you just don't have to worry about it with a townhouse, and we view that as a net positive. Now, on a related note, another reason why you should consider buying a townhouse is you don't have to deal with condo or co-op rules. Now, of course, the rules for a typical condo or co-op are, generally speaking, not unreasonable. However, the problem is in the unequal application of these rules, which is a common occurrence, is particularly for co-ops, but also even for small condo buildings in New York City. To put in another way, perhaps some owners are held to a higher standard and held to every last rule, for example, in the condo house rules, compared to other owners who maybe are on the board, have a more privileged position, possibly having held an apartment for longer. So if you're not a fan of politics like me, then I think that is one of the main reasons why you should consider buying a townhouse instead of a condo or co-op in New York City. So we've gone over a few reasons why it's a good idea to consider buying a townhouse in New York. Now we're going to give you a few reasons as to why you should maybe not buy a townhouse here in New York City. Now, one of the main reasons is the actual cost and time associated with maintaining the property. Most people who are first-time buyers in New York City have been accustomed to living in apartments over the course of their years in New York City. As a result, the responsibility for repairs and the coordination for problems has been borne fully basically by the landlord or by the building super or the management of the rental building or the building where the apartment was located. So in other words, the typical first-time buyer in New York City has essentially no experience in dealing with repairs and actually owning a property. Now, of course, when you buy a condo or co-op, you still have to deal with maintaining your own unit, certainly, but you have help. You also have limitations on the scope of work that may be required. You'll never have to directly repair a roof yourself if you own a condo or co-op. The building takes care of it. You'll never directly have to deal with a facade or a structural issue because the building is the one who's responsible. But when you own a townhouse, you are responsible for literally every single side of your building. You have to deal with the roof, you have to fix the facade, you have to fix the sidewalk, you have to deal with mechanicals, the boiler and boiler inspections, fire sprinkler systems. It's a lot of things. Now, it's not overwhelming, of course, like anything in life. If you're at the point where you're buying a townhouse, you've achieved many things and you definitely can figure out how to manage a property, but there's a bit of a learning curve and obviously it does take time. So, if you're the kind of person who's unfamiliar with home repairs or you just don't necessarily have the time or patience to involve yourself in that type of thing, we would encourage you to actually reconsider buying a townhouse and probably refocus more on condos or co-ops. Now, one other reason why you should potentially not buy a townhouse is the issue of lack of light and exposure. Many people in New York are very familiar and accustomed to having properties on, say, higher floors, properties with southern exposure, bright apartments with views. A lot of people, that's why they're in New York. They like to feel like they have that view and that commanding poise and position when they're in their home office and such. Now, that's not to say you cannot get that with the townhouse, but functionally, it's a lot harder. For starters, of course, the ground floor, that's a wash. That's not something you're going to be able to tolerate if you expect to have, a bright home. Of course, you have the parlor level, which is typically the most, premier and high value area in the townhouse, but it's still not, that high off the ground. We certainly have high ceilings and large windows and stuff, which do bring in a fair bit of light depending on the exposure, but it's still never going to be anywhere remotely close to that high floor. Of course, you have the higher floors in the townhouse, third or fourth floor. If you buy a multifamily townhouse and you're okay with a smallish apartment and you're not looking for like a duplex, you could potentially rent out the lower floors and maybe reside in the highest floor unit in, of course, the townhouse. So, there are ways around it, but just to be clear, if you are looking for a full-blown, loft type of experience with excellent exposure, or just maybe a newer condo building, really high floor, super bright, see the sunrise, see the sunset type of thing, a townhouse probably is really not going to do it for you. And of course, at the end of the day, notwithstanding the benefits of buying a townhouse we talked about in terms of getting more acreage and more square footage and more exposure to the asset class, you're ultimately going to live there. So, if it's not bright enough for you, if you don't like the view, if you're afraid of, critters and things like that tend to reside on the ground floor in New York, a townhouse is just not going to be a good idea for you as a primary residence. So there you have it. We went through a couple of reasons why you should buy a townhouse, a few reasons why you should not. It's ultimately your decision, but if you are looking to buy a townhouse in the city, we can help you save money through our House It Buyer Closing Credit service. Learn how by visiting houseit.com, and you can also send an email to team@houseit.com or give us a call at 888-494-8258 to discuss your particular search. I'm Nick at Houseit, and we'll see you on the next video.